also why you all think that you are on this panel. Why were you asked to be a part of this discussion? So go ahead.
Jim, thank you very much. So I always start from Buffalo. Born and raised in Buffalo, with one of the best football teams in the country. Go Bills.
I don't know about that.
We will see come Super Bowl time next year. But I'm from Buffalo. And Joan, you spoke on coming and visiting and landing on your doorstep. And for everyone out there, I'm sure you've heard, it came and landed on our doorstep less than 3 months ago. So when we talk about equity and social justice, we have a city that is marred with segregation. Wow. We have a city, unfortunately, based off of the lines that were drawn 100 years ago, it still reflects the income disparities, it still reflects the racial disparities all throughout our city. And we had an individual that preyed on that, came to our city, because you can see it in our community. Others can see it from outside. And I'm sure that we are not the only city that looks like that. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir from many of the urban areas, many of you from rural areas as well. But we are a city made up. And if I tell you what street you grew up on, I can tell you your race and likely your income. And so when I say I'm a kid from Buffalo, that's who I am. I get to look out my window at City Hall, and I get to see my alma mater, Hutch Tech. And I get to see my passion, which is the water. I get to see the Niagara River and Lake Erie and the confluence that it is, and our water intake. But I also am able to try to connect with the people that I grew up with and connect water to them. So that's why I think that I'm on this panel here. Hopefully it's from my background. Hopefully it is from my learned experiences, my lived experiences. And hopefully I can share just a little bit about what it means to be a kid from Buffalo.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. Cheryl?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Uday. I am the Senior Advisor to the Chief Operating Officer at DC Water. And I think you've all probably heard quite a bit about DC Water when Ms. Powell spoke yesterday, but we provide water and wastewater treatment services to about 670,000 residents in the district. I would love to venture to say I think it's one of the coolest places to work. I have probably the least tenure of any of my colleagues, and several of you in the water industry specifically. I've been in water for about 1.5 years, DC Water that entire time, and I am also new to DC, so have only been in DC for about 1.5 years. But what I can say about DC is being a city of movers and pushers and decision makers is that it is also a city like many of our urban cities across America, where we have, about 50-50 or a little bit more than 50% people of color. 40% of that are our Black population, represent also our lowest income, most impoverished parts of our community, and has been a historically Black area, part of the country for a very long time. Our northern, sort of northwest parts of the district represent our more white, affluent areas of the area, and DC Water itself is about, I think, 83% people of color, 23% women. Our executive team now really reflects what the majority of our community looks like, with 66% people of color and about 1/3 women. So I'm sure that and why I'm on this panel. So as I started to mention, being one of the least tenured in the water industry, I have a long history of actually advising mayors and commissioners, state legislators across several different policy areas: affordable housing, justice reform, police reform, education, and so on. I decided specifically to come into the water industry because I think that it makes up a huge part of our ecosystem, that I honestly had never participated in a conversation across all of the policy spectrums that I just mentioned, and it never came up. Why is that? And then coming into an industry where it's what we live, breathe, and think. And so I think I bring the perspective of all the other pieces of the world that it touches. And I just simply ask people to sort of raise up sometimes out of the weeds of the technicality and say, well, what does that really mean? What does that mean to our community? We talk about our pipes, our lead pipes, when we talk about investments. And something as simple as saying, what is the language and the word that you're speaking out of your mouth really means, and think about the power or how it disempowers. So those are some of the conversations that I lead. Thank you.
Great. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you all? So I'd love to, come up with some innovative reason why I'm here, or some actually honest reason why I'm here. The real truth is, a colleague of mine, Hugh, actually invited me, and then he told me, like, some of your really good friends are going to be here, like Keisha and others, so you need to be on the panel. So that's in part why I'm here. But as I've been thinking about we had a conversation a few weeks back, planning for this session, and I've been thinking a little bit about some of the things that I'd like to share. And there's a lot happening at the Environmental Protection Agency at this point. Many of you are aware of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Close to $43 billion in the wastewater and drinking water sector. In my specific portfolio, at least on an annual basis going forward, it's several $billion will be invested. We're doing a lot of work in the technical assistance space. So I wanted to have a conversation about how, as an agency, we're thinking about supporting communities, the communities that OJ talked about, the communities like Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, where we have underserved populations who have a fundamental capacity issue, and we do have a significant amount of resources available to potentially help those communities. And how do we do it in a sustainable way? Well, after the next 5 to 7 years, when much of the investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law has essentially expired, how do we continue to create a level of sustainability in communities across America? And so my job in the Office of Water, I'm the director of the Office of Wastewater Management, and I oversee the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. That's the NPDES program. So if you're discharging into waters of the United States, you will need to get a permit from either EPA or a city government or a state government from the NPDES program. And then I also manage most of the major financial programs at EPA. I started with FIA, I also managed the SRF, ran the SRF program in Maryland. So I have a history of working with local government and ultimately with EPA. But I want to talk a little bit about a portfolio approach, if you will, an integrated approach that we're thinking about how to address the issue of equity and affordability in a sustainable way for the foreseeable future. So that's the reason why, that's the conversation I'd like to have today.
Great, well, let's get started with some questions. So OJ, you say you're the kid from Buffalo, you know what it's like, you're from that area. But for many people in our industry, they don't have that reference point. They don't understand what life feels like. And so there's the disconnect. So for those who don't have the background that you have, when we talk about these very loaded issues of justice, how does one fill that gap of knowledge and experience?
I see Cheryl is nodding her head. You want to jump in on that one first? Go ahead.
It's a good pass. It's a good pass. Okay.
Smooth, I like that.
No, that's a good, I love the question, June, because I think it's so much of the work that's embedded in all that we do, and so I can answer it in several different ways. There's a nice sort of like formalized, structured way, but I think it's important where you have senior leadership, sponsorship, and advocacy to say, this is important and this is how we're going to move. So that's just like, I don't want to call it the easiest way, but that is how things trickle down throughout the rest of the organization, and we have done that through our Blueprint 2.0, our strategic plan that has an equitable imperative and has outlined for the next 5 years how we will move and work. And then, so there's that piece, right? There's the formalized, printed, sort of polished piece that we're implementing throughout the organization, and then there's just the day-to-day. And so the reason why I love that question is because while we look at things like how do we prioritize equity across our, let's say, capital improvement planning? There are times where me as a, growing up as not being an engineer, when I'm working with a group of engineers, where we jump out and we rush to a solution often, and needing to work with those teams to pull back. So, for example, we took about a month or two just to define what equity means when we talk about prioritizing our capital improvement planning. And then when I talk about getting into the weeds of, we use the word equity a lot and we use the word justice a lot, but when you really start talking to folks, you realize that they don't always really understand the depth of what the word means. And so it was as simple as spending time, sometimes offline conversations, sometimes workshopping, that when we say equity and justice, it is an acknowledgement that an injustice actually exists. And it's interesting because when you then start to really spend time on that sort of discourse, you realize how many people don't understand the local and the place-based historical injustices that got us to where we are today. So I would say it's as simple as like leading that discourse and humanizing it and bringing a really humble approach to also understand that your colleagues may not understand that and therefore they don't acknowledge it and they oftentimes end up in an uncomfortable place that either makes them apathetic or disengaged. So allowing yourself to move through that discourse and knowing that that's part of the process of planning.
So clearly we've
She
acknowledged
said.
it. Yeah. Do you want to add, or, because I got another question. Don't mess with a good thing. So we talked about acknowledging the discourse, so we're acknowledging it, we're talking about it, that's why we have these panels. But let's look at how much has changed, if any. And OJ, you've been in the industry over 20 years, and you've seen then versus now. Has there been change? Do you think it's enough?
If it's enough, no, absolutely not. But there has been significant change. I'll speak to you in Buffalo. When I was hired, this is a majority minority city. When I was hired in 2006, I was the 5th person of color to be employed at the Buffalo Sewer Authority. That's atrocious. It's 2006, not 1956, but 2006. And so what we made a promise to our community was really to stand on our values and to diversify the Buffalo Sewer Authority to where it reflected the community in which it served. And so over the years, over the past 16 years, this is what we've done. And that change started just as where Cheryl's talking at the top. You diversify not only your board, then you diversify your executive management team, and then everything works from there. And you have to get down to your middle managers, and you have to make sure you're getting folks in the door that reflect your community. That has been something that has happened in our city, something that we had to be very deliberate in making happen in our city. And I think that's what seems to be missing oftentimes in the water sector, is that we're not being as deliberate as we need to be. We talk about it. We talk about it. We talk about it. And slight changes are happening. One of the biggest things, I've been very blunt with our consultants, are, hey, listen, our community is demanding that we reflect the values that they are, that we reflect the community. And so, you guys need to reflect the community. And it's not enough for you to talk about it. I'm telling you, with our rubric and our valuations, we're putting it in there, and you're going to start losing jobs. So your business depends on it. So you look at Buffalo, you look at the amount of money that we're spending for public health benefits on the water side, and that's a lot of money. So we're demanding that our consultants follow the same way that our city is doing.
Well, it's interesting because Cheryl mentioned that talking about justice implies that there is injustice. In order to make shifts, we need political will, we need money, we need champions. So from a federal level, there's a lot of support you can give to sort of these on-the-ground agencies like ours. There's funding, there's technical support, there's policy and legislation. Oftentimes it feels, though, from a retail level, that going through the sheer application process of some of these funding especially for communities that are small or disadvantaged, they seem to be further left out because they don't have the expertise and the resources to be able to hire consultants, to have the staff. And I know I saw this in California with the pandemic when the state made over $1 billion available. Agencies like ours got the money, but agencies and areas that really needed it didn't even bother to apply because it was too rigorous. So from a federal level, what kind of support or changes do you think could really start moving the ball forward faster?
Thank you, and I'm feeling like this might not be the panel for me. I'm just listening to these two and I'm getting really into the conversation. No, it's a really important question. One of the things we have done, and I like to talk about the broader issue of affordability and how we're addressing it. And you're absolutely right. I think the question you asked, OJ, how much has changed? I think we've accomplished a lot, but there's significantly more to be done. And to the point you just made in terms of capacity, or lack thereof, for many of the communities that we're serving, just the inability, if you will, the financial inability or just the skills inability to get some of the applications in, whether it's to the SRF or to WIFI or to some of the other grant programs, it's not there. So one of the first things we did, and many of you are familiar with Radhika Fox, who is the AA for the Office of Water. One of the things we did, we issued the SRF implementation memo in March of this year. And there are some strategic directives in that memo that I think will actually have a very, I think it will live on for several years to come. We prioritize 49% of those resources, so about $23 billion over the next 5 years will be going out as assistance to disadvantaged communities. But as we started to look at communities across the state and how the state SRFs were set up, many of the communities that actually receive disadvantaged funds were not actually disadvantaged. And so we wrote the implementation memo in such a way where the states now had to pick specific criteria that we knew focused on disadvantaged communities. And in some cases, you actually had criteria that were prohibitive, that would not allow some of the low-income communities to have access to these resources. And so we deliberately, and if you look at the implementation memo, we actually put several criteria in there that says, these criteria we're encouraging you. We cannot mandate it because the states have the ability to set their disadvantage criteria. But here are the criteria that we would like for you to consider. And frankly, to the extent you have prohibitive criteria, we would like for you not to consider those. And so after we've been doing a bit of assessment, at least 29 states to date are now changing their disadvantage criteria that will actually provide access to the very communities that you're thinking about. And I think about those policy directives, and one of the key things you said, June, this idea of accountability champions. So whether it's OJ or whether it's Radhika or whether it's Andrew, we actually have to have those accountability champions because, OJ's point is a really critical one. There's a lot of resistance, frankly, in the sector to actually provide access to many of the communities that we're thinking about. But as we have these efforts where the president made a directive that we want to get these resources to low-income and underserved communities across the nation, we have a fundamental obligation to make sure that we put in place programs and policies that will do that. And frankly, I feel very good about what, at least for the next decade, in terms of the resources we have available, the bill and the base SRF program, you're looking at billions being invested on an annual basis. And we're now seeing state programs change to accommodate these communities. At EPA, in my office, I'm standing up several technical assistance programs that will probably put north of $50 million in the sector on an annual basis doing exactly what you just suggested. Helping communities write the right applications, helping communities to understand their skills gap, their resource gap, making sure that many of these communities that historically never had access will have access. I'll provide one final anecdote. Last week, Radhika Fox, the head of EPA, Michael Reagan, and the USDA head were in Loudons County in Alabama. And they were actually, we have a new program that we're standing up in my office. It's called Closing the Wastewater Gap. We're selecting 11 low-income communities that never had traditional sewer. They will now have access. One of the things we will do, we're spending several millions where we're going to do an assessment of the concerns in those communities. what solutions will work for those communities in terms of providing, whether it's centralized sewer or just septic systems that work. But that is an effort that, I think about, this is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time. How do we get our decentralized communities better access? And we now have the resources to do that. But the intentional effort from Radica and the team at USDA, the commitment from the heads of both agencies to do that. I saw an article this morning, frankly, got a note from my staff this morning. It reached 101 million in terms of audience, over 350 stories on closing the wastewater gap. It tells me that we're making it, it's slow, but we're making a difference. People are starting to understand the commitment to the agency, the commitment to the administration, the commitment to the team, my team. I'm just so incredibly proud of my small team that actually helped to make this happen. But it's going to take accountability champions across the board to change how we invest, how we make our low-income, underserved communities sustainable. And I'm passionate about this, June, because I spend a lot of time making sure I provide finance for every community across this country. I stand up with you, which is for the large communities. We have invested almost $33 billion in communities across this country. WIFIA serves a specific community. I want to also make sure we can reach America's poor, America's underserved. And I think we have, the personnel, the commitment from the leadership of the agency. And I think to your point, we have to figure out a way to intentionally get to the underserved communities to get access to our resources.
Well, certainly no doubt this is near and dear to your heart and you're passionate about it. I think you just jump off the sofa right now. That's good because that's what you need. You got to have the energy. This isn't something that you just sit back and we'll just get to it when I get to it, because you use the word resistance. Who could possibly resist justice? Shocking, but it's true. Who are the resistors?
So I could the part of it, a lot of people I think this is a fad, it's just going to pass. EPA will not invest their money in low income. We don't have a choice, when the bipartisan infrastructure law passed, it says 40%, it says 49% must go to disadvantaged communities. You also have Justice 40, which is a commitment from the administration that 40% of the benefits accrue to underserved communities. So I think there are a lot of people who think this is just something that will pass. I can tell you from within the agency, it's not passing.
It's not a fake.
It is a commitment.
I saw you get excited.
No, he's right. I think there are some folks out there, many, and unfortunately in the water sector, that think, this is just a passing phase. We'll get back to what we're doing. We'll get back to our status quo. And this is something we've said. This is the new. If the social interactions and kind of the visible social injustices that preceded the pandemic, and the pandemic just pulled further the covers back from all of the issues that we have in many of our communities, here we are putting our money where our mouth is, and I love to hear that from the EPA, and then it's on us to ensure that it gets done. I tell people all the time, listen, I can come up with a reason to replace every pipe in my system. Every pipe in my system, I can come up with a legitimate engineering, everything's aged, right? Why are we avoiding doing the work in the underserved communities? Many times we'll have public meetings. If you're going into one neighborhood, you're gonna have a public meeting, you're gonna get 100 people show up, you're doing $1 million project. You go into another neighborhood, you're gonna do a $10 million project, and it's you and the council members and your consultant teams. Every community is different. We've stopped doing public meetings. We're going to your block club meeting. Thank you for inviting us. That's how we are presenting our projects throughout the city now. We're not standing up our own meetings. We are finding the opportunity where you are already there. We're asking you to kind of bring us in there, to shepherd us in there to your people as a trusted entity. Many of our block club, many of our Aunt Rosie's, in the communities. And this is how we're bringing the projects. And we're really focusing in. So through modeling, we're layering all these things on top of each other. We've developed our own equity index, but we're really focusing in on delivering those projects in those communities with those communities. Because if you're not talking to your communities, you are not delivering the right project. And I think Cheryl, started with that earlier, so.
No, you're right, you gotta go to where the people are. But before we go to Charlotte, you said status quo.
Yes.
What does status quo look like in our industry? Let's just assume this is a phase for a second, and we go back to status quo. What does that look like? Describe it.
What does status quo look like in our industry? Again, doing the projects that we have been doing with no knowledge, right? With no understanding of the equitable injustices that are happening and that have happened, right? And I think Cheryl nailed it when she said, you have to acknowledge that things were done wrong. This didn't just happen, Our communities didn't just end up looking like this. It's a shame when we pull up the redlining maps and go, wow, this is like they were soothsayers, because if you look at our communities now and you look at the demographics and you look at the income disparities, it so closely fits those maps from 80 years ago. And that's what status quo is.
Can I just speak to status quo briefly? So status quo to me means EPA would just put together a protocol, a funding protocol on an annual basis, and okay, go ahead, fund projects the way you typically fund projects. States would just go off, select their projects, and they will do exactly what they've been doing for the last 30 years. The status quo is very different now, where we're actually creating pilots. I just talked about the closing the wastewater gap pilots. We're also developing these lead zones, lead hubs as we're calling them. We're picking certain states. We're going to pick about I think we start with 4 states, potentially we'll be beyond 4, and start to develop these lead-related projects. We also have what we're calling these community solutions team, and we're going to be picking, and I don't like to use the word picking, we're working collaboratively with about 30 or so communities, where the idea is to actually develop teams that recognize what OJ just talked about. The community personnel, the community leader would be central to that team. We'll also have engineers, we will have the consultants, we're having the environmental finance centers, which are partners to EPA. EPA invest in several environmental centers across the country. So we're going to have these solutions team. But at the heart of it is utilizing the knowledge of those community members to help build what I think is required going forward, a sustainable project. Not a project that will collapse after 2 or 3 years, because it did not have the perspective of the people who are actually going to be impacted by it. But it now has those, those perspectives, and from where I sit, especially running a state SRF program about a decade ago, where I had to go back and invest in those projects repeatedly, simply because we did not get the true intention of what was needed to make those make those sustainable. So this idea behind our community solutions perspective at EPA now, where we have these community solutions team focusing on solutions that are beneficial, mutually beneficial to residents and homeowners and the community, I think it's going to be, it's going to help us significantly going forward. So that is actually not the status quo. We're doing something fundamentally different than how we have historically.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes important to say and state the obvious. That way it sort of highlights and puts a spotlight on the injustice. Now, Shara, you have a very diverse background. You've done incredible levels of work in this area for different sectors. So now you're in water. So as somewhat of a newer comer, you have a fresh perspective. If you were to compare our industry to some of these other sectors that you worked in, there's a big smile. It's gonna be good. How would you say we fare if you were to compare us? And what are some of the things that you're seeing when you entered our industry that just made you shake your head?
It's like we've talked before, but we haven't, It's like what's on my mind. So I think some of the biggest shockers were that, so if you think about where I've worked, and again, police reform, justice reform, education, affordable housing, people have been shooting from the rooftops for 400 years, okay? So sit with that. Injustices have been called out for 400 years, and have had direct ties to things like slavery. And when I say things like that, coming into the water sector about we have I work alongside colleagues and those outside of the DC Water who are uncomfortable with using the word vulnerable community, who are uncomfortable with using the word historically disadvantaged. And so that was shocking because I have stepped into rooms where I've had entire neighborhoods yell at me for injustices in affordable housing when I wasn't even there for that particular topic. And then I had to realize throughout that process that when it gets to that level of tension, that there's hundreds of years of it that exists, and it's historical and generational, and that it's not about me, right? And so that's part of what the conversations that I try to have with my colleagues. It's about years of trauma, years of discrimination, and that every single system is tied to the other. So I think one of the things about water that was so distinct for me is that I don't know how to just think about water. I can't even make myself, because when I think about water, I think about my lived experience with water. My grandmother had potable water, and as I moved up sort of the income spectrum, my experience with water has shifted. So I was like, how is that? And the schools kind of got better, and then like the neighborhood, and then there was sidewalks. Everything is interconnected. So I don't know how to participate in conversations about, lead replacement or capital improvement planning without also talking about maybe they didn't show up to that community meeting because that single mom has to go to an after school something, or has to pick up her kids, or maybe crime is prioritized and not water until it looks brown, right? So those are the, I think, perspectives that we oftentimes just don't think about in the water industry. And there was something that you said that sort of stuck out to me about what I think you essentially said is we meet people where they are. So instead of creating a whole new community meeting, and I just had a conversation with some of my lead replacement colleagues about that. I said, why aren't we asking ourselves, who are the anchor institutions in the community? Where are they going to their places of worship, and why aren't we showing that?
Yeah, the idea of going to church and where people gather, that's kind of new in our industry. When I started in the industry in 2003, the best meetings are the ones that no one shows up. The best projects are the ones that you never heard of. Right? That's our measure of success, and certainly we're no longer there because there is this demand. So, with OJ, having worked in these communities, but you also serve in a lot of different capacities on different boards, so it's not just in your region. When you look at, as Cheryl talked about, the system of systems, right? We are connected, we are affected, not just in the infrastructure, water and wastewater, but we are tied to housing, we are tied to the economy. How do you go about sort of looking at different efforts across the country? And how do you stay engaged in that network of other champions? Because I'm sure in your region you have a very strong network of those who are making progress in this area. But because I sometimes struggle with it. I think venues like this and these kinds of opportunities allows us to connect those outside of our typical area, and I've learned a lot from it. So how do you go about, in your role, because you're both the, your general manager, CEO, but you're also the chair of Buffalo Water, and so there's this dual role that you kind of play. How do you stay connected?
Thank you for that question. I'm looking at Andrew and I'm thinking about Radical. And that is one of the reasons. It was actually U.S. Water Alliance kind of pulled in our city along with other peer cities and learning from the best, like a DC Water. It was Atlanta, it was Buffalo, it was Camden, it was Cleveland, it was Pittsburgh, it was Milwaukee, and we all were able to come together with water and equity as our focal points. And really being able to be with that core group and to learn what they were doing and borrow, steal, however you want to look at it, and bring it back to Buffalo and say, okay, how can this work for Buffalo and how can we adjust it for our community? So if we're, whether that was our programs on affordability, or whether that was our programs on how we could energize our waterfront or workforce. Many of the programs that we're doing in Buffalo, we have borrowed from our peers. One of the programs I'd really like to touch on is our workforce, our green infrastructure stewardship program. We were able to go to Camden and Philadelphia and see what they were doing there with their AmeriCorps dollars and said, we don't have to reinvent this. How about you guys come here and do that same program? And we've stood that program up. We've had multiple cohorts that have graduated, and they come right into our workforce. But that's the piece, that's the circular aspect that we're really focusing in on. We talk about these public health benefits that need to happen in our communities. In a community like Buffalo that has a 30% poverty rate, it needs to happen by those people in their community. And right now, workforce development has to be the way we go about doing it. All of our dollars now, if I look through my blue sheets and I do our pay apps, that money is being extracted and going outside of our community because we don't have the minority, we don't have the women businesses, we don't have the local hires. And so one of the things that we have really focused in on is ensuring that that money to solve those public health issues like lead service pipes, like drinking water concerns, like our water quality and clean water concerns are being done and then brought back to the communities here so that we can uplift this community as an anchor utility in this area. So, you know, one of the things that we really have been focusing in on has been that workforce. If we're going to be part of our community, we need to make sure that we are uplifting it at the same time.
Absolutely true. To have an industry that's focused on people we serve, you also have to have the workforce, the professionals who are always focusing on people, and that opens up a whole other topic that we can talk days for, but I'm really glad you mentioned that because that's an important piece to making advancements in this area. Nicole, who is my reporter for the breakout session, is also my timekeeper, and I know we have about 10-15 minutes left. I want to just scan the audience and see if there's any questions because I don't want to be a question hogger. There's a hand. Oh, there's a two hand. Like this feels like there's three, four. Look at, I'm getting excited. So we'll go with the first gentleman. Yes, you, the one that you're pointing. Okay, we'll go Jeff and then the gentleman with the ponytail.
Okay, great. I'm wondering if you have tools to quantify equity and justice so you can kind of apply it to every project that you do.
I don't know if everyone heard that, but is there a tool, something that you can apply to projects and efforts to really take a look at it from this equity lens? Did I capture that correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll take a quick opportunity. I'll take the opportunity to respond to that quickly, and I'd be happy to, for others too. Generally, what I encourage people not to actually have a single tool that applies across various communities, just because they're so different. And so much of what we're doing, at a minimum, I think what is important to have perhaps a baseline template to understand what's actually happening in that community. So to both Cheryl's and OJ's point, the idea of meeting many of these communities where they are and understanding what is actually happening, the status quo, if you will, the characteristics of that community, what are their financial benchmarks, what are their water quality benchmarks, drinking water related issues. It's good to have that, but I think as you start to think about solutions, it is very difficult, and then again, you can have mapping exercises to understand where some of the broader communities are in terms of affordability issue, and then you can drill down to find specific households, because you'll find that affordability is very much a household as well as a community issue. When you get to solution, that's when it becomes a little difficult to have a single tool that can address many of the issues. They are generally customized. You will need to have different types of engagement with the various community members. You're going to have different solutions, essentially, to many of the problems. So having a single tool to do assessment and solution, I don't think you're going to have that. I think a lot of folks are trying to build some of those. Frankly, this is an opportunity area for the sector, actually, to use technology to help address the broader affordability issue. But having single tools, I don't think that's, at least from my perspective, I don't think you can have a single tool to address sort of the broad portfolio of affordability concerns that we see across this country.
Go ahead.
Yes, so that's an area that I think I'm very proud of, and I believe DC Water is really leading in. We have created a framework and assessment tools for our clean energy portfolio, And we are specifically looking at scoring them based on some equity factors, carbon reduction, and then resilience. And resilience is not specifically tied to just infrastructure, but also community resilience. And then we have run that across a value effort scale to look at what is the value to us as DC Water, and then what is the value to community, and then honestly how much effort it takes to actually implement the projects. And so what that allows us to do, and we customize it for ourselves, to Andrew's point, and looked at sort of place-based things like how many jobs does this project create in a particular vulnerable community? How many energy jobs does it create? How does it address utility burden? And so we had to customize it based on what our local economy and the needs of our local community. So, but we are, to your point, taking that framework, because you got to start somewhere, and then applying it and customizing it across various types of portfolios and projects. But really, that's about culture change. As I always say, in absence of this process and of asking these questions, then what are we doing? And once again, that's the status quo. We're picking the cool, green things that may be nice, but who does it essentially benefit at the end of the day?
Now, if you are very detail-oriented and you're looking at your program and saying, hey, isn't there supposed to be 4 panelists? Where's Jason Smith? Jason Smith is right there. Jason Smith is from the mayor's office from Miami-Dade County. Come on up. You know, it's better late than never. When you work for the mayor's office and you're so close, you can't just get on a plane and be on time. There's always demands, right? It's always that. When you just need to get away, something else comes up. So I know we got some questions. And for those of you that have questions, if we do run out of time, there's a breakout session. So there's 3 sessions to choose from. I'm not saying choose ours, but maybe I am. You can come and ask your questions and give us your comment. But I wanted to give you a chance, Jason, to say a few words. I mean, this is a very loaded topic. We're talking about equity, affordability, social and environmental justice. There's a lot there. And without the political will, these things don't move. We talked about the resistance and status quo. So can you talk a little bit about the role that you have seen for the political will to be there, and what has been your experience?
So I'm Jason Smith. I'm the Director of Equity and Engagement in the office of Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava. And when Mayor Levine Cava was elected, in one of her first messages to the community, she said that she would be leading with what she called the 4 E's of equity, engagement, environment, and the economy. And she signaled not only to the community, but to the staff, the 29,000 employees in the county government, that was the new lens through which we should approach our work as county employees. So when we think about equity and its intersection with the political will of government, it's important to have leaders at the top who set the agenda and lead with their values. And so she began her administration with this idea that we will connect with the community in new ways through engagement, and we will ask the community, where has the county previously failed in meeting its role as both as a provider of services, but also as the protector of our environment and community development. And when it comes to equity, that's one of the key things that we should do. The best practice is that you begin to engage communities that have traditionally been left out of the decision-making process. And we worked with a cohort of nonprofit foundations in Miami-Dade County to fund the county's first and most comprehensive public engagement campaign. We surveyed the community. We got responses from about 1% of our 2.7 million residents here on what the needs are, where they saw gaps, either in funding or programming or service delivery. And we took the learnings from those surveys, and we held civic engagement sessions, both online and in person, and then more targeted workshops with the community. And what we developed from that intentional effort was the mayor's action plan for her first 4 years. And, you know, from my perch, this is our equity action plan. And we called it Thrive 305. 305, of course, being a local area code here. And, you know, it's online. We published documents. We published the action plan. And the action plan really speaks to different areas of county services. One of the areas, of course, is our water and sewer system and resilience efforts. And the community said that they value Biscayne Bay and our natural resources, but they also realize that a lot of the underpowered residents in the county are on septic systems that if they fail, they will pollute Biscayne Bay. It becomes a health hazard. So they wanted to see a comprehensive plan to get us off of septic to sewer. Off of the septic tanks onto the county sewer system. And like I said, that has effects for the overall environment, protecting our environment. So the mayor has set aside money, both federal and local dollars, to do a septic to sewer conversion program. And we started that program in our most underserved communities. So, it's all about being intentional, pulling in the community, and I think someone said going to church services and hearing what the community has to say. Engagement is key to our efforts when it comes to lifting up equity, but so too is the need to lead with your values. Don't be afraid to say that, hey, equity is an important part and plays an important role in our water and sewer system.
I really appreciate that perspective, and use the word fail, asking the question, where did we fail? We rarely do that because we don't want to feel like we're failures, but it's a really important question. And speaking of a question, I promised that gentleman right there with the glasses. What's your question, sir?
Hello, Khalil, born and raised in Miami-Dade County, so shout out to the mayor, stuff like that.
California's cool too.
Yeah, that's true. There's been a trend at the summit of depoliticizing the issue of water, which this panel obviously has not followed. But what are your thoughts on that, right? Because we have a lot of water managers, water scientists, and different people who are very technical, but you can be as technical as you want, and if there's no politics, then you won't get the funding and these different things. What do you think of that trend, and how do you think this summit should address it to resolve that issue?
I guess the question, if I was kind of paraphrasing it out, if everyone could hear, is sometimes we're very technical, and without the political dynamic, these issues don't get addressed, let alone be resolved. So from the political lens, it's sort of what you see as missing or what you would love to see happen politically to shift these dialogues forward. What does that look like? And maybe we'll just kind of quickly.
So depoliticize, is that what we're going with this one? I will tell you this, I have met frequent occasions with my mayor. We started out on a Imagine a Day Without Water, and I was able to interview him there. And years and years ago, we were in front of an issue as far as our lead service lines go. You had that one article that comes out, and kind of everybody puts everybody on notice. But without the understanding of the politics, so your mayors, your aldermen, your council members, you're right, that things don't get moved. So it is necessary for them to have an understanding. And when we speak about Miami-Dade and your mayor, I know you want to jump on this one, is when she starts off and says, my 4 E's in equity, and we're talking about water, there's nothing more that's going to move that. That as a commissioner, that allows you that free reign to get your work done. It is prioritized not only within yourself, but it's prioritized at the highest level.
So, so I'm in DC, so there's nothing depoliticized about it. No, but so I feel like we talk about these things all the time, and so it's not, I wouldn't call it a non-issue, but I think, like what I said earlier, a lot of this starts top down, so I think our leadership really sets the tone, and we extend across every aisle, across the bipartisan aisle, as well as just need to get outside our utility. I think it's really that simple. So, partnering with leaders of other kinds of utilities as well as other kinds of organizations to really build that buy-in so that we all understand why it is we should be working together. Sometimes I think it's as simple as that. Keisha Powell is great with that, sitting with top leaders across transportation and energy and so forth. And so we all kind of have to move on the same bus together, because the reality is all utilities and service providers really need each other. And then we do a lot of work with our legislative team in terms of our colleague and really building those relationships. I think it goes back to, I always use the word intentionality, really being intentional about that. But I think where we are sort of juxtaposed in the nation, it sort of makes that, I think, a little bit easier for us.
Yeah, so I want to touch on that portion of your question about how, things get a little technical and you may lose maybe an audience. I mean, it's important that, one, you just speak plainly about what the issue is. I know as I was preparing for the summit, I was, jotting down notes about our, the millions of gallons per day, the MGD, our laterals, and, the wastewater, the difference between our wastewater system and our water system, and how some communities, I was going down the rabbit hole. And of course, when you speak in those very technical terms to the community, you will lose them. And they don't get that, hey, water is life. And, everybody uses the toilet. That waste has to go somewhere. And you gotta just speak plainly and simply. And some of that language plain language will help you build the case for an equitable water and sewer system. And you can work with your communications team, either the mayor's office or your political offices. They're very good at, dressing down the language and making it accessible to the community, and just being very real with how high the stakes are when it comes to water. Last year, one of our big budget fights during our budget process was the question of, should we raise our water and sewer rates in Miami-Dade County by $30? I mean, that was it was going up from like maybe $430 to $464, but it was the difference between our system continuing and our entire system just failing, and us not meeting the requirements of our consent decree. And we had to get real, from the Office of Engagement. We had to be very clear with our community of why we needed a rate adjustment. And we didn't look, your water, your safe drinking water that you enjoy on a daily basis could be at risk. And we had to just explain the way we structure our water, these fees. If you use less, you pay less. But this small investment will help us continue providing you, good quality service, good drinking water from the water fountain, from the tap. So you don't have to buy bottled water. You don't have to buy, filtered water. I mean, you have to really be intentional about, I don't want to say dumbing down the language, but just being very clear and making it real to people why these investments and these types of investments, these equitable investments, are important.
Well, we're past our time, and I want to be a good moderator because there's a panel after this. But I know that there's more comments, and I certainly wanted, Andrew to answer that. But again, we'll save that for the breakout session to keep the conversation going. Like I said, for those of you who raised your hands, please join us, because I think this is a very important. It's not just a topic; it's the way that we operate, and how do we operationalize it? How do we actually make an impact, a difference? So let's give our panelists a round of applause.